Comic books are weird, right? You got aliens taking jobs as reporters, teenagers getting bit by radioactive arachnids and crawling on walls, and most unrealistic of all, billionaires who care about common people. Yet comic books are certainly a magical place where anything and everything is possible, which is why it can be so difficult to get these things into live action. After all, we do live in a world with specific rules and restrictions, the likes of which just don't exist in the world of comics. It's one of the reasons why certain alterations and concessions need to be made in order for this transition process to be complete. But it always sucks to find out that a thing you liked in the original didn't make the leap from page to screen because it was impractical, but rather as a creative decision made by the storytellers. And this can be for a number of reasons. Maybe it didn't work in the original story, or perhaps it's intrinsically tied to the medium of comic books itself. But sometimes, the reason why it doesn't make the cut isn't for any of these reasons, but instead because the storytellers are sort of embarrassed by them. Like, they don't feel that these elements are worth being brought from the original to the new iteration. Or worse, they don't feel that the audiences that they're trying to reach will accept them. I previously dubbed this lack of confidence in the graphic novels these stories hail from as comic book insecurity. A phenomenon that's occurred since the inception of superheroes in film, resulting in things like the X-Men losing their colorful costumes, Superman exclusively fighting real estate developers or other Kryptonians, or the stripping back of all supernatural elements within a Batman story in favor of telling a more grounded and realistic tale. It was assumed that this was a thing of the past now that we had things like the MCU introducing us to characters like Thanos, the Guardians of the Galaxy, and hell, even Eternity in that one Thor movie. But I am sad to report that while we are exploring the more niche and exotic elements of these universes, unfortunately, comic book insecurity is still ever present, it's just taken a slightly different form. And that's what we're going to explore today. What is the new form that comic book insecurity has taken within the modern era of superhero stories? How has it changed from its original inception? And is it destined to remain, or are there signs of change on the horizon? So let's discuss. So the rise of comic book insecurity goes hand in hand with the increase in their budgets and legitimacy in the eyes of the public. And this is more applicable with their live-action interpretations over their depictions in animation. So characters like Batman, Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Justice League, all of them were attempted in the realm of 2 and 3D animation, to varying levels of success. Animation also has a closer link to the medium these characters originated in, considering both are various colors and shapes attempting to replicate the human form. Big difference is animation obviously has sound, motion, and all sorts of effects that comic books just can't replicate. But it is inherently closer to what these characters started as, which is why it's easier for them to be done more faithfully than their live-action counterparts. But in terms of live action, as last we discussed, there was an era of time in which comic book insecurity was really not entirely present. Roughly up until the Batman 1966 series, they were having to move what they could from one medium to another. It was after this that the fan backlash resulted in people questioning what they should and should not bring over from the original stories. That's why you got things like Tim Burton's Batman trying to be as dark and edgy as possible, in stark contrast to the bright knight portrayed by Adam West. But really, they were just throwing whatever they could at the wall to see what sticks. Obviously, this approach didn't go fantastically, considering it ended with the train wreck that was Batman and Robin. But as I said before, Blade and X-Men helped usher in the modern era of comic book storytelling, which involves star-studded casts, massive budgets, and changes galore when anything goofy from the comics would rear its ugly head. That last part would be upended, however, with the implementation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. While at first they also stuck to this cookie-cutter approach, their initial handful of films, including the first 2 Iron Man movies and The Incredible Hulk, were as grounded as they possibly could be given the subject matter. And as they trucked on and introduced characters like Thor and Captain America, they would continue to take this tepid approach, dialing back as many of the magical elements in Thor's universe and claiming most of it was just technology masquerading as mysticism. They also stuck him in the desert for 90% of the film, so that definitely helped. And Captain America's story was limited to the 1940s. Allowing them to save his stranger tales for when they felt more confident with the direction of the character. So while they were working with characters that before their big screen debut were pretty obscure, this wasn't necessarily a new phenomenon. Again, we did have characters like the Hulk appear in movies before this, and general audiences never really knew who Blade, the Punisher, or Daredevil were before their films came out. So really, Marvel is following the lead of its predecessors at this point. And likewise, their insecurity of the material they were adapting was comparable to their contemporaries. Maybe a little more confident than things like Daredevil and the X-Men, but still on the same level of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man and Ang Lee's Hulk. No, it wasn't until the Avengers did they really go out and take a risk, attempting to adapt something that no other superhero film had done before, that being comic books' shared continuity. But you already know this by now. Blah blah blah, shared cinematic universe, blah blah blah, they all take place in the same world, blah blah blah, it's all like a long-running TV series. The main thing of note I want you to take away is that 2012's Avengers would create the mold for how Marvel would approach its adaptations moving forward. But we'll circle back to that in a minute. For now, let's see what else was going on around this time. We had previously discussed that Batman Begins had released to a massive level of success, and this was all in spite, or possibly as a result, of their insane level of comic book insecurity. And with its follow-up films, particularly The Dark Knight, this just basically proved that the medium of comic books was not fit for the silver screen unless a heavy amount of alterations were done. It just wasn't going to happen. So you can imagine their surprise when something like The Avengers was met with an even greater level of success. Because their entire approach to the style of storytelling was to divorce it from those silly stories originally designed for children. But now you have Marvel over here taking up the scream of characters like Iron Man, the Hulk, and Hawkeye all hanging out and making out and whatever the hell they were doing in that first film. How on God's green earth did that happen?
How did this happen? We're smarter than this.
So after Nolan finished up his Dark Knight trilogy, DC decided, you know what, we gotta do what they're doing. But because the team they tasked with overseeing this imitation of Marvel's success were still steeped in the comic book insecurity-ridden waters that they got their start in, what they would create was kind of all over the place. As a result of the lack of confidence in the characters and stories they were adapting, they ended up doing crazy things like taking the hope out of Superman, the moral ambiguity out of Batman, and the love from Wonder Woman, though her first film fared better than her follow-up appearances. DC's movies did everything in their power to stand apart from the pulpy action-adventure stories in which they hailed from. And the problem is not only that they shied away from many aspects that made these stories special, they almost seemed to have an active disdain for the comics themselves. Like that they were inherently broken and that only a creative team such as themselves could fix them. And this, along with a handful of other factors, led to this universe's inevitable downfall. In fact, the funny thing is the only parts of that universe that seem to be surviving are the ones that approach the original stories with nothing but reverence and joy. That being James Gunn's Suicide Squad and Peacemaker. And maybe Blue Beetle. There's also Aquaman. I like Aquaman. But now he's Lobo, so those stories don't count anymore. But while DC was doing everything in its power to take away all the things that made its characters unique, Marvel was hitting its stride with its latest string of outputs. Now, as a whole, many of you would say the MCU is very comic book accurate. And I agree, they do take it further than normal. And sometimes it generally does seem like they want to do right by the source material. And they are certainly doing a lot better of a job at respecting the integrity of their characters than studios like Fox and Sony, who also own Marvel properties. But where Fox failed by stripping so many elements back that made these stories special, see for example the Fantastic Four, or as it's more affectionately known as Fan Four Stick, which does nothing to resemble Marvel's first family. And meanwhile, you have Sony's complete and utter lack of vision when it came to its live-action depictions, giving us train wreck one after another, until they just caved in and gave Marvel back the rights to Spider-Man. But only partially, so we still have these weird Sony-Marvel adjacent films going on, which you don't need me to tell you have no respect for their comic book counterparts at all. But since they don't seem to respect filmmaking in general, we just go ahead and ignore their existence for the purposes of today's discussion. All of this messy and dysfunctional intellectual property management resulted in the feeling that the newly dubbed Marvel Studios was the only one who knew how to tell these types of stories. But the problem is, in many ways, you can see that the comic book insecurity is still well and truly alive in them. Because while they are willing to adapt characters like Ant-Man and Doctor Strange, they do show a degree of embarrassment of adapting these kind of stories. They never miss a chance to lampshade some of the more ridiculous things they're putting to screen. Things like Ant-Man asking if it's too late to change the name.
Is it too late to change the name?
Or Doctor Strange giggling at all the weird spells he's asked to perform. Show that while they've accepted the stories they are choosing to tell, they aren't fully confident in the material being able to stand on its own, without preemptively taking it down a peg or two. It's kind of like that kid in high school who likes comic books but obviously can't tell everyone for fear he'll get shoved into a locker, so publicly makes fun of them as to fit in with the rest of the crowd. This is also why these movies have a heavy amount of quipping.
Is that normal?
Sadly, yes, this is normal.
In an effort to hopefully distract from how goofy some of the material these actors are delivering is.
Just Wong? Like Adele?
Some exceptions where they stick to the bit and play it straight do exist. The first Captain America movie, the Guardians of the Galaxy, and the Avengers movies do more to celebrate the stories that they are adapting, but this is more the exception than the rule. And I think when you get down to it, a lot of them just lack that genuine sincerity for the medium in which these stories were born. Say what you will about some of the earlier outings, but things like Spider-Man and Hulk demonstrate a true excitement for bringing these characters to life. But now a lot of these things are just so cynical about how hokey and strange everything all is. Just look at what happens when MCU Spider-Man interacts with the villains from the quirkier Tobey Maguire series, making fun of Octavius' name, being like,
Wait, no, seriously, what's your actual name?
or poking fun at the fact that both Sandman and Electro got their powers by falling in the vats of magic science. And yeah, of course they did. This is a superhero story. That's how these things work. What's even worse is when they have creatures or beings who come from different planets or realities, all just talk like regular Walmart greeters. It was funny the first couple of times with characters like Korg,
Oh my god, Emma pulled you off.
but it got old real fast. And now we're at the point where pretty much every robot and alien creature we meet all talk like the same hyper-quippy coworker who stay up to date on the modern lingo. It's like the only aliens with differing speech patterns are like Drax the Destroyer and his inability to understand sarcasm. Like, that's supposed to be the tip of the iceberg. I get that some of this stuff is out there, but that's the very nature of the comic books you're adapting. Running away from them and being afraid that someone's gonna make fun of you is never gonna be as effective at combating these criticisms than standing tall and proud and just owning it. It's for reasons like this things like Thor Ragnarok and the Guardians of the Galaxy franchise stand apart from the rest of the universe, in the fact that they completely embrace their origins and celebrate how wacky and fun these things can be. Playing the absurdity of the situation straight, and never trying to find a way to water down these ludicrous concepts in order to make them more digestible for general audiences. But you can tell a more grounded, realistic story without doing a disservice to the characters you're adapting. Things like the Daredevil series on Netflix did a great job at bringing the character from page to screen, while maintaining that more darker, serious vibe. By choosing to focus on comic book runs like Daredevil Born Again that really lent themselves to this particular style, they were able to faithfully tell the story they wanted without being at odds with the character's roots. And now we reach the part of the discussion where we identify why this is something that keeps occurring. As you can see, the aversion of being too faithful to the source material is baked into the very framework of the adaptation itself. But its rise to prominence is most notable come the turn of the 21st century. Because as I said, these films are seen as major investments for big returns. Intellectual properties that are to be cultivated and maintained by these massive conglomerations in order to maximize their revenue. And because the studios from all over are going to do what they can in order to make sure that these stories that they tell reach the broadest of audiences. Because if you're dealing with something like the Avengers, X-Men, or Justice League, and pumping them full of budgets that surpass the $200 million range, then you're not just hoping nerds and dorks like myself are gonna come show up to the theaters. No, you want every last man, woman, and child to shell out 15 to 20 bucks to see these things on opening night. Otherwise, why are you putting so much money into the cast, the effects, the writing? Okay, maybe not the writing, but those other two I mentioned. And I recognize that these projects employ thousands of people, all of whom do this as professionals, and not just because they're a bunch of comic book nerds who want to see a live-action rendition of Squirrel Girl. And I totally respect that, these are people who are trying to make a career in filmmaking. My criticisms are more with the upper management, the people who are really steering the ship, and less so with like the gaffers, the best boys, and the line producers. And I hope in this discussion I haven't just come off as a fan who will never be satisfied. I've got a lot of love for the movies I've mentioned. I even find enjoyment in some of the bad ones too. My big issue is the lack of sincerity that I feel is plaguing the vast majority of the ones being released. But I do think things are making a turn for the better, as a lot of the recent superhero fare has been rejected by fans and general audiences alike. So studios will hopefully read the room and take the necessary steps to course correct, by ensuring that the right people are placed in front and behind the characters in order to see these projects come to life. People who both know the craft of filmmaking and have a genuine interest in seeing the intellectual property they are attached to done justice. And if the live action projects refuse to learn this lesson, at least we have the animated ones to look forward to. Eventually. Maybe.